Hi, I'm indie fantasy author Melinda Kucsera, and in this episode of Fantasy Lore and More, we have Joshua Blum, and he's joining me to talk about his book, Empty Hands. So I already want to know why the hands are empty and why that's important. But welcome to the show, and tell us about Empty Hands.
Hi, thanks, Melinda, for having me. Yeah, so Empty Hands is I guess you would call it a novella.
Oh,
It's a it's not a short story, and I meant it as an interlude, basically, to a larger novel. I guess you could say that these are all fantasy books, but I guess I describe them also as, I guess, fantasy books for people who have had trouble getting into fantasy books and are looking for something a little bit more straightforward. So I think the focus mostly is on characters as opposed to building a world that's very different in some ways, than ours. And a lot of these stories were influenced by my own martial arts training. So I started training in martial arts when I was 13. And so this one in particular is essentially a martial arts story in a fantasy world. And it's about specifically the training part of it, and how the main character is a young man named Logan, who's about 18 or 19 years old. Um, he, for all accounts, is a horrendous soldier, but was, for a variety of reasons, picked to join this group called the Imperial Rangers, and it's sort of a more elite group, and he really kind of wonders why he was chosen, because he doesn't have any particular special talents in anything. He can't march. He hates just about everything that he has to do, and he was really only there because he was drafted at age 18 to be serve his in his kingdom's military, sort of a mandatory thing. And he's from an area of the world that is pretty rural and far removed from the city he now finds himself in. And so the story really is about his training and learning to work with seven other of these rangers as they all kind of come together from different backgrounds and to try to learn to work together as a team, because that they will be really depending on each other after their period of training is done. And so, when I was about how old was I? I must have been 19. I had written a book called, or a very early draft of a book called The 13th Hour. And that's the main book. And this is an interlude in that story. So I didn't publish that particular story for a long time. I only did that, basically decades later. Uh, Not long after I had my first child, which I'm not really sure in retrospect why I chose then to do that. That was not the best idea, but
it made you re-examine your life, and you're like, I wrote that book and I never did anything with it. It's
there
a
we
new
go. Yeah.
beginning. I'm a new
Yeah.
parent. I'm going to be a book daddy too.
Yeah. It must have been something like that. And that was, I think, in 2014. And then since then, I've just sort of added to the world. And this particular book that we're talking about, Empty Hands, was a little segment that I essentially edited out of that book. I had the ideas for sticking it in there as a chapter or something like that, but it just got too big, and I wanted to give it its due sort of justice, and so I cut it out, and I wasn't fully formed yet either, so I just shelved it and then put it away for later. And so eventually I got around to writing it, and here it is. It's a little interlude that can be read totally standalone. It's not, when I was a kid, I always had a lot. I always wanted to really like fantasy stories. I'd go to the bookstore or library and look at all the covers, and it looks so awesome. And you see all these things, and you'd see ads for things like, I don't know, Dungeons. I grew up in the '80s, and so you'd see ads for things like Dungeons and Dragons and stuff like that. I knew nothing about any of this stuff when I was a kid, but it looked awesome.
Hmm.
And then I remember going and going to bookstores and looking at all those covers and these fantastic images and stuff like that. And I would pick up the book, and I would just have no success actually getting into the majority of those books, a lot of which stemmed from the fact that I would start with book like 2 or 3 out of like a
Oh,
4-book series because I couldn't find the first one and didn't
yeah.
understand at the time that you probably should start at the first one. And it was just so much harder to find things then. The bookstore maybe only had the 3rd. They didn't have the books of, 1 and 2 or whatever, and so you just kinda took what you
And
could
they
get.
didn't number them because I've
Oh,
done the
that's true.
same
Yeah,
thing.
that's
I
true.
picked up
Yeah.
some books and then you're reading after you finish it, you're like, "Oh, wasn't there a list of books in the front?" And you go back and you consult it and you're like, "Oh, I read book 4. No wonder I was a bit
Yeah.
confused."
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
remember having that experience in the 80s. Like they didn't number the books and like you had
Right.
to like there would be a list of also by either in the front or the back and they
Yeah.
list it by series and you'd have to go through that list and be like, "Oh, I read the 4th book of the 5th trilogy in this. Okay, no wonder it seems like there's a lot of things that came before. There were a lot of
Right.
things that came before and I didn't read them because I didn't know about them." And then you start trying to figure out how to find them and you go back to your Barnes and Noble and you've got your little list and
Yeah.
you cannot find a single book
Yeah.
that was listed in the front and you're like, "Well, now what am I supposed to do? I read
Right,
book
right,
4. I
right.
want to read book 1, but where do I get it?" I remember that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I think, I mean, I don't know, this sounds maybe antiquated or weird to say now because everything is a lot harder to find, but just figuring out even the order at which you're supposed to, which it makes sense, I guess, to read these things in, or I guess that would be the same with movies, watch them in a particular order so they kind of make some semblance of sense. It was just kind of harder you had to know somebody kind of that already did it. And so I didn't really know any people when I was a kid who could give me that information. And so fantasy was always, and science fiction was always a slog in some ways because I always wanted to like it. And I liked the imagery and the ideas and so forth, but actually reading it was frustrating. And so one of the things when I got finally old enough to kind of create some of this stuff myself is like I want to read something that I would have liked to found when I was a kid or a teenager, and so that's how these books came to be. But yeah, my point in saying that, very long-winded point in saying that, is that they're all the things that I've written are meant to be standalone. So if you just happen to pick up one thing and you haven't been able to find the others, that's okay. You can read it in isolation without necessarily a whole lot of knowledge of the other stuff that goes around it.
That's really cool. So there it's a series of stories that can stand alone or they could be read as a series.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You had asked about the empty hands part.
Yes.
So empty hands. So I guess the literal translation of karate is empty hand.
Oh, I didn't know
And
that.
yeah. And there's I remember when I first started, this sort of training, I probably was, teenager or something like that. But there was a man named Ed Parker who was a pioneer martial arts instructor in like the mid part of the 20th century, like one of the founding fathers, I guess, of martial arts, like Western martial arts in this country. And he would have like a little prayer that or creed or whatever that he would have students say, in class, and one of which was revolved around this idea of empty hands because they were training in karate.
Mhm.
And let me actually see if I can find it because it's kind of I've always liked it. I did a different style at the time, and it always had stuck with me. And that's kind of in the course of this book, I sort of paid homage to it. And this is the quote. It says, like, "I come to you with only karate, empty hands. I have no weapons, but should I be forced to defend myself, my principles, or my honor, should it be a matter of life or death, or right or wrong, then here are my weapons, karate, my empty hands."
That's cool.
And yeah, and so I kind of at that quote has always stuck with me. And the idea of this particular book is that you have this group of 8 soldiers who are learning to use their bodies and weapons, and to defend themselves and other people. And there's a little ceremony as part of sort of almost like a pre-graduation where they get assigned a particular sidearm that they can carry. It's sort of like the one they'll probably spend a little bit more time on the final stages of their training with. Although they're kind of supposed to learn how to use everything, but everybody may have their own preferred thing, and it's called the drawing. And it's kind of rumored to be this thing, and no one really knows how it works or how you get matched up to your particular weapon. So there's a lot of hoopla about, well, which one am I going to get? Everybody's kind of looking forward to, or kind of speculating, and including our main character Logan, who sort of bumbles through most of this in kind of a clueless way. Um, and without giving, I guess, too much away, he spends the most time on the unarmed or empty-handed techniques. And so it's mostly about that, and how the idea of that just because your hands are empty doesn't necessarily mean you can't use other things in your environment. And so part of the training is also, of course, looking around at things you could use, even if you don't happen to have things at your disposal to be able to defend yourself with. And so that's part of the idea of using the environment, I guess, in such a way that it now becomes essentially your weapon, as opposed to just having to depend on something you carry physically with you.
This is all reminding me of a scene I think it was Winds of Fate, or no, the Mage Winds trilogy by Mercedes Lackey. There's a scene in there where they're trying to teach the princess, because she's got to go off on a diplomatic mission, and like, well, you need to know how to
Hmm.
defend yourself. And they won't. And she thinks, oh, they're going to teach me how to use weapons and things, and I'm going to be the coolest
Yeah.
person in the room. And the weapons master like gives her nothing, and she's like, okay, kill me, try to kill me with, using anything in the room. And she's like, there's nothing in the room. And then there's this whole, it's a cool scene where she's like, well, there's the bench, you could hit me over the head with it. And she starts naming all the things in the room that the princess wasn't seeing, and all the things she could put to. And then she gets mad. The princess, she's like, well, why won't you teach me to use weapons? And she's like, because you're going to be there as a diplomat. You're not
Mm,
going to have weapons. If somebody
sure.
attacks you, you're going to have to use what's around you, and we're going to drill at this until you can find one way to kill me with absolutely everything in this room.
Yeah, exactly. That's the exact same
Yeah.
idea. And in fact, this is, I guess I should say something about the fantasy world that it comes in.
Yes, please.
It's kind of I guess it would be kind of akin to, like, our Middle Ages, I guess in a Western sense. So there's no guns and there's no
Right.
electricity and things like that. But there's things like swords and castles and that sort of stuff like that. And so because of that, they spend a lot of time, learning how to use the spear and sword, and and Logan, who kind of doesn't really like a lot of this stuff, is just bored to tears with all of this. His favorite exercise actually is they have a bunch of wizards that are also teaching them, and they will hold this little sort of training session where they'll give them a couple things, like, here's a potted plant, here's a bench, use that to defend yourself, and here's a bottle of ink, and what can you do with just these very mundane things, because again, um, you may not have other things. So
Yeah. To the observant, the world is your weapon.
sure, yeah. So there's this idea in I think it mostly comes from, like, Tibetan Buddhism, but it's sort of filtered through a variety of different martial arts. And
Hmm.
so this in Japan, there's like a form of Buddhism where they talk about there's like these different elements, and they relate that to other parts of life. So um, there was actually a Japanese swordsman, who wrote a book called The Book of Five Rings. I don't know if you've ever read that, but it's a
Yes.
fairly,
I read it.
yeah, yeah,
Well,
it's
it was
a
the audiobook, but still
yeah,
counts.
yeah, actually, totally. And the five rings go through these different five elements in the world. So earth, fire, wind, water, and the last one is usually translated as the void, or um, I guess empty space, or
Mm,
potential, I guess you could say. And so um, the that exercise of like trying to use things in your surroundings to defend yourself is sort of a void exercise, where you're not relying on any one thing necessarily, but you're kind of adapting to whatever the situation uh, demands. And so that actually ends up turning out to be Logan's strength, because he's a creative guy. He's not particularly strong or fast or agile or any of those things, but he's a pretty creative guy, and he finds through the course of the story that that ends up being his sort of calling card in a way.
that's
And but
interesting.
it takes him the story to,
Yeah.
and I would say most of the later book that this is taken from, 13th Hour, is essentially Logan's story. So he serves as the narrator for both, and it kind of comes to more terms with that in the larger volume. But in this one, it was a very focused little thing, because it was just really
Yeah.
relying, or sort of about their period of training.
So it's more like an internal quest.
Right. Yeah, it kinda and, he's like 18 or 19 years old, so it's like all the stuff that you might be thinking about at that age, like, "Who am I? Where do I fit in the world?" And, those kind of things
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah, no, it's more of an internal quest, which is interesting that they're using the training to focus on that. That's really and also the quest for them to come together as a unit. So it's like an internal and external quest. It's interesting. Should we go to the excerpt? Did you want to say anything else about empty hands or martial arts? And this has all been very fascinating.
Well, I guess, yeah, I mean, we can certainly go to the excerpt. The only other thing I would say is
Oh,
that,
sure, go ahead.
The when I was writing this, growing up, when I did, I watched my fair amount of like Saturday morning cartoons and things like
Yes.
that,
We
and
had the
I
best
don't.
ones.
They are right. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
we
I don't,
did.
yeah, maybe it's just biased, but I take it from listening to your show that you're probably also a child of the '80s.
Yes,
So
I was born in
yeah,
1980, so we had the
yeah,
X-Men on Saturday
yeah,
mornings. We had, I think the first anime I've ever seen was Technoman Blade, which was on Saturday
sure,
mornings or
yeah.
Sunday mornings. Um, yeah.
Yeah, so I remember when I was younger, like, there was all the,
He-Man
Captain
and
Planet, Ca
She-Ra,
yeah,
Captain
He-Man,
Planet.
Captain Planet, GoBots, Transform
Yeah.
and I guess there may still be this idea. I think there probably still is, but, a lot of it just seemed to be a lot of the cartoons and also the movies revolved around this, like, assembling a team concept, where you had, like, different uh, disparate groups, or disparate people coming together to function as a unit. They all had their own little specialty, or their own little thing that made them unique. But they were stronger together than they were individually,
Mm.
right? So that's essentially, like, I guess, taking that idea and putting it into kind of a book form, was kind of like the idea of this particular little novella.
Ah, it's cool, and we had the original Power Rangers.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess, like, yeah, right, right. Like that. That's like kind of like that idea. Like, they even have different colors and different. That was a little bit like, so my brother. I have a younger brother
So do
he's
I.
yeah, 8 years my junior, and so he watched a lot of the stuff that kind of came in like the early to mid '90s that I had stopped. Or I didn't really watch that stuff as much. I was like a slight um yeah, I guess we technically are different generations, right? But,
Yeah.
I was a couple
It's like
before.
my sister's 4 years younger before she passed away, and, like, the stuff she watched was totally different from what I watched. So 8 years, I
Right.
can imagine, like, that's, like, a whole other generation, like, it was
Yes.
very different cartoons then.
Yes. Yeah. Um, And I'm sorry about your sister. I remember looking at listening to some of your early podcasts, and then how that kind of formed an inspiration for some of your writing and stuff like that. So that's very, very touching, very, like, good for you, you know?
Oh, thank you. It
Yeah.
was hard, but after it's been almost it'd be 10 years this February, so I am coming
Yeah.
out of the I will always miss her, but
Yeah.
it's not like I can move on with my life. I've made peace with the fact that I'll never know exactly what happened in that hotel room or
Right.
why she passed away, and I
Yeah.
will there's questions that will never be answered, and it's after 10 years I've made peace with that, and I can move on. Like for a long time I couldn't. I just couldn't accept what had happened. You know, your sister goes on vacation and you don't expect to get a phone call a week later that she's passed
Right.
away. That's
Yeah.
it's just not
Yeah.
it's not in anybody there's never a thought, you know?
Yeah.
So,
No.
she
Yeah, we
was
just had a family.
29, it was no
Yeah.
you don't
The
think
last
about
thing you
that.
think of.
Yeah. So,
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't wanna send the podcast off on a sad note. She'd be very proud of this,
Yeah, good. I think, like, when we talk about things like fantasy or science fiction or maybe any kind of literature, I guess, like, um, even though there's an element of, like, which is getting very, very different from our day to day life. I mean, I
yeah.
think in the best case scenario, it allows you to reflect on your own reality in a different way. Hopefully, that maybe there's some distance that makes it easier to think about difficult things, but it's still like a good fantasy story or a good science fiction story or whatever is still delves into these, like, core kind of like human values and ideas, I think, anyway.
No, I think you're right. I couldn't bring my sister back, but I could bring back the dead sister of my main character, and she could be an
Sure.
angel and still help them do things, and
Sure.
then maybe she
Yeah.
should get into all sorts of trouble as an angel, because why not?
Why not?
Her
Why
as
not?
a
Yeah.
character.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's no reason not to have fun with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But that's for another time. We were
Another
talking about
time.
empty
Yeah.
hands. But yeah,
Yeah.
should we
Well,
hit
I
that X go on.
sure. Yeah. 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 I have an excerpt here, and so I guess it's just as a small, like, one last background thing.
Sure,
So when I
sure.
did um, this book in particular, I had a couple little things that I did just mostly for me to have fun with,
Mm.
and so sprinkled throughout the text are little, like, quotes that I pulled from 80s movies, and if you can
Oh, that's so
identify them
fun.
at the end, you can basically. There's like a little matching game you can do. Like, I don't know if you remember from elementary school where you, like, match this one with this one, and you put all the letters together, and that's the code to unlock, like, a prize. So if you go through and you can identify all the quotes, then you can get a little prize afterwards. And so that's one thing. So there's some quotes to 80s, like early 90s movies in there. And then there's some music. So I've never known how to describe this totally, but when I first came up with the idea for the 13th hour, I didn't envision it as a book. I envisioned it as kind of like a, I don't know, maybe movie or video game or something like that, because I saw pictures, I heard music, and when I wrote it down, that was because I couldn't do the other stuff yet. I was like, well, I guess that's the next best thing would be to write it down and essentially, like, narrate it, even though that seemed like a poor substitute to this thing I had in my head. And then I drew pictures that went along with it. So it's illustrated, but it's not what I originally had envisioned, which still, to my knowledge, does not exist. Like, you don't have a book that you can flip through and then you sort of press a little button on the page and then the little movie plays in your, right before you, and you can flip to the next page and then you can, do the same thing. So I guess an ebook or the internet, I guess, would be the
Mm.
closest equivalent, but it's not a book that you can just sort of fold up. So I don't know. But when I was doing this one, I had written music for it, and then interspersed throughout, the music was all written as basically the soundtrack for the story. So when you're reading through it, you could click on the little passage, and then, I mean, if you're connected to the internet, it'll the music will basically start playing. It's hosted elsewhere, but it'll start playing through, assuming your device has speakers. So if you're reading it like on a phone, like on a Kindle app or something like that, it kind of works relatively seamlessly. So
That's cool. So before we go to the excerpt, so the 13 is the 13th hour. That's is the title of a book. Is it also the name of the series?
yeah, yeah,
Okay, so it's
it's
both because
yeah,
the way you're
it's
using it, it
basically it's
seemed
both.
interchangeable. So all right,
Yeah,
cool.
yeah, it's also the name of a few other things, but I won't get into that right now.
We'll get
But
into that after the book.
yeah, we'll talk about that later. So at this particular point, the main character, this is all written from Logan's, or told from Logan's perspective, and he's basically sitting in the barracks at the end of a hard day. So I'll just start reading there. A few weeks later, I lay in bed, stretching, again listening to my fellow Rangers playing cards. I was sore from the day's workout and had a few nagging injuries, mostly from our sparring sessions. That always seemed to bother me once I stopped moving. You guys may not want to hit each other so hard, Clavis, who's one of their trainers, would sometimes say during the training sessions. You've got to last all year, he'd always say, generally with a chuckle. At 2, sometimes 3 training sessions a day, pain was a frequent companion. Sometimes anger, humiliation, or just plain aggression would win out, and you'd forget about the pain temporarily, but it always came back. And non serious injuries never got us out of more training. Oh, you injured your ankle, I remember Clavis saying the first time I'd hobbled into practice. I nodded, hoping I'd be able to sit that session out. Oh, anything wrong with your arms? No? Great, he said, without missing a beat, motioning to the ground. Push ups first, then pull ups. And after that marathon session, neither my upper nor lower body had worked well for days. I'm not sure how others dealt with their injuries, though they all had them. At that moment, Jake twisted slowly in his chair, and there were firecrackers as his spine popped. A few of the others did the same. After sighs of relief, the conversation turned to the drawing. You remember that essay Wally assigned us to write way back? That's one of the wizards, Blake asked. You know, about our strengths and weaknesses and such. After a few nods, he continued, I bet that was preparation for the drawing. They're probably going to use that to match us up with our weapons. What? I thought that was just a flaky exercise to get us to be like more active learners or some junk like that, said Lance. I knew I should have written something with more substance. Maybe something about swords, he added. You guys actually wrote something? I blew that off the second Wally told us to do it, Aaron retorted. We recall quite well, Aaron, Lance said. Aaron's face reddened. It's pronounced a. Alan interrupted with a sigh, still looking at his cards. Yes, yes, yes. Haven't we figured out by now that we all know how to say your name? If you didn't react with such fervor every time. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Aaron butt in. Whatever. I'm going to clean house after the drawing. Then we'll see who's laughing. As Rangers in training, we weren't actually paid money, so any chance someone found to scrounge up a little capital was always met with interest. The closest thing we had to currency were paper tickets that could be traded in for drinks or snacks at the soldiers' commissary. We earned a certain number of them each week by cleaning the training floor, sweeping the hall, mucking out the stables, polishing and repairing the training weapons, and so forth. If you saved enough, you could even get booze, but the alcoholic content was so low it was hardly worth it. Still, the drink tickets were the only things we had of any real value, so they were often used as poker chips. Oh, really, Aaron, said Jake. Didn't you learn your lesson last time? He asked, referring to an ill-fated bet Aaron had lost some months back with one of the female guards that had left him not only embarrassed, but destitute. Aaron's face blanched for a second, then appeared confused. Ah, shit, I forgot about that. Jake sputtered. Are you serious? How could you have forgotten? It's right there in this room. We watched you hand over your entire gambled life savings and nearly lose your genitalia in the process, he said, referring to a thrown Imperial Guard dagger that had landed mere inches from Aaron's groin. I actually felt sorry for you for a few days. You sure milked it at the time. Aaron shrugged. Yeah, I'm a gambling man. Can't win 'em all. To win big, you got to do what? Lose big. He shrugged again. Are you implying you're a loser? Blake asked with a sly smile. Maybe, but not today. Aces over queens, boys. Beat that, Aaron said, laying down his hand. There was a round of groans as the rest of the men threw down the cards and passed Aaron the drink tickets. Unbeknownst to Aaron, I had a whole slew of drink tickets. But since the others never invited me to play cards with them, I never really liked the taste of alcohol anyway. My drink ticket stash kept accumulating. Occasionally, I'd use one or two to buy a pastry or some candy, but the baked goods were left over from the king's breakfasts and were usually stale by the time they made it to the soldiers' commissary. And the candy was never quite as good as it looked. The only things I sort of wanted were a few tattered comic books and pulp novels that looked like the kind I enjoyed as a kid. I figured they'd give me something to do other than stare at the bunk above me at night while the other guys played cards. But since it was a city and there weren't that many trees, paper was scarce, which was ironic since most of the paper was imported from forested regions down south, like my hometown of Aquaria, where the literacy rate was abysmal. Needless to say, I couldn't afford the books yet. While Iran continued cleaning house and going on about how he was going to get smashed in an endless series of drinks that had 1% alcohol, I found myself thinking, as I often did, about Aurora. So this is a segment where it starts to actually play, and I actually just clicked on it now on the on a page of a music on a site called Bandcamp, which is a for where indie musicians can post their stuff. So this is a track entitled "Memories of a Better Time." And so my memories return to simpler days, and I recall the time when I was about 6 and had snuck over to the library near the schoolroom on the first floor of the orphanage. There was a staff member on each floor to provide the requisite adult supervision. Logan grows up in an orphanage. But that person often fell asleep, not long after the kids did, so if you wanted to scrounge a midnight snack from the kitchen, there was a good chance you'd get away with it if you were quiet in your feet. I'd had a nightmare and was unable to fall back asleep, and pattered over to the library to look at some picture books in the moonlight. That night, as I was sitting by the big floor to ceiling library window, looking at the painted illustrations in a fairy tale book, my eyes came to rest on Dragon's Eyes, a fairy tale that had been turned into a lullaby and a popular ballad by the same name. I couldn't read yet, but nevertheless, I stared enthralled at the illusions of the flying creatures in all their savage splendor. Unlike a lot of people, I had actually seen dragons since they'd killed my parents. I don't think I entirely understood what that meant then, but I knew my father and mother weren't coming back and that dragons were responsible. And looking at the illustrations, I remembered the nightmare that had woken me. It was always a variation of the same thing: running, screaming, the screech of diving dragons, and then a sweltering, sulfuric inferno that would wake me up, heart pounding, short of breath, sweating like there really had been a dragon breathing down my neck. I dropped the book quickly, my heart pounding in my chest, as if the nightmare had again woken me. "Logan?" came a voice from the entrance to the library, startling me. It was Aurora. "Couldn't sleep?" "I had a bad dream," I said. "Me too," she said. And as she sat down next to me, still wrapped in my blanket, she looked over at the illustration in the book, flipped through the pages, and said, "Do you know this story?" I shook my head. She studied the book. I don't know all the words yet, but I can read it to you." And so, under the light of the moon, Aurora read the tale of Dragon's Eyes. She had to skip over a few parts where there were lots of big words, but I got the gist of the story. I knew enough about life then to know something of courage, pain, and the greed of man. It was a story that I would come to know well, for it would become one of Aurora's favorites, as well as her favorite song to sing. And there's another instrumental track here. But that first time, I don't recall if we made it through the whole thing. The next thing I knew, it was morning, and I woke to the frantic shouts of the orphanage staff bursting through the library doors, followed by their exasperated sighs of relief at finally discovering the two children, who had seemingly gone missing the night before, now curled up underneath a blanket in the morning sun. Not all my memories of childhood were good. Despite the overall positive atmosphere of the orphanage, there were the usual vicissitudes of growing up, accompanied by the periodic cycles of hope for adoption and disappointment when I realized it wasn't going to happen. But as the case with so much of life, our memories are selective, and on those nights in my corner bunk listening to the men play cards, the memories that came were the good ones. The smell of the tall pines, the quiet sounds of the deep forest at night, the night sky with its twinkles of foreign worlds, the sound of Aurora's voice, and the optimistic hope for a better tomorrow. And that's where I'll end this uh, excerpt. And it goes on, but that's a little snippet of Logan's life in the barracks and a flashback to a scene when he was probably about 5 or 6.
Oh wow. There was a lot there. So he lost his parents to dragons, as happens when you live in a fantasy world. That's one of the dangers.
Yeah,
That's why I wouldn't want to move to one.
it's
I don't
true.
want to die in a
It's
dragon attack.
true. Yeah,
Just because somebody made the dragon angry, I don't want to end up extra crispy.
right. Exactly. Yeah, and as often the case, the the uh, the identified hero in a lot of these stories is has bad things that happen
Mm,
to him, and then that forms their reason for being who they are and doing what they do.
yeah, but like even in the real world, like I think that bad things happen to everybody, and
Yeah, yeah,
different things. But so I don't think it's fair to like say that only in fantasy books do the heroes have bad things happen
totally.
to them. I think that's I think that's too much of a generalization.
Yeah,
But yeah. So so the rangers in this world, do they fight the dragons? Like who do the ranger like so we've got the rangers and he's got to learn to be part of this cohesive unit, but what do the rangers themselves do?
yeah.
What are they
I
protecting? I,
Right.
I know that's
So
not part of the novella, but I'm curious since this is
yeah,
also the
yeah.
lead into a longer series where I presume that we
Right,
do see the rangers
right,
in their official capacity.
right. Yeah. So there's a segment in the I guess you could say the appendix of this little book about what the Rangers are. But and then in the beginning, it goes through a little bit about an introduction about the individual characters that you'll be meeting and a little bit about them. But I kind of envisioned them as part diplomat, part um, military, and then also part. Um, I guess you could say almost like the detective or guard. They have some like functions that if there's a problem and the police or the military don't want to deal with it or can't, then they may call in the rangers to deal with it. And the idea kind of was that they might be able to do some things that the police or the military couldn't do. And at the time of this story happening, the premise was that the Rangers were sort of something that were disbanded, decades ago. It was something that was nice in a bygone age, but there hadn't been any for decades. There hadn't been any money to train them, and there was nothing to train them for. And then the king, the current king, decides that he wants to live forever. He's getting older and he wants
Oh.
to live forever. And so he decides, in the manner, I guess, of explorers in places like Spain and whatever in the Renaissance, decided that we need to go find things like that will help us do that, sending our explorers to the new world. And so he says that he found a legend that uh, and this is talked about in the main book, The 13th Hour,
Mhm.
that says that, well, actually there is something that will allow a mortal man to live forever, and you have to go to the ends of the world to find it. And to do that, he decided to recreate or reform this Imperial Ranger group and have them trained to do that. And so that's the mission that Logan and his 7 compatriots were chosen to be trained for. So this is a tiny little snippet in a portion of that training, and but the bigger story itself is the story of the 13th hour.
Okay, and that's when we go hunting for the fountain of youth or whatever.
Essentially,
Yeah,
yeah,
whatever
yeah,
grants it if it's not a fountain.
Yeah.
That's
Right.
interesting.
Yeah. So as you correctly guessed, it's not quite a fountain. It's a little bit different than you
Yeah.
think it's gonna be, not necessarily something that you magically drink and makes whoever drinks it, live forever, but it is a kind of forever, and, so the king, who's a kind of a schmuck, doesn't exactly get what he's looking for, because he does get it in the end, but, that's the case with a lot of things, It's not exactly what you thought it was gonna be.
Right, right, right. Because that would be too easy.
Right, yeah.
We can't we can't, just because you wanna live forever doesn't mean you gotta struggle. You gotta earn it, dude.
Yes. So, I don't know if you remember or listen to, but there's a song by a group named Alphaville, they're from Germany, called "Forever Young," and it was,
Oh, I maybe.
you've heard it,
It
but,
probably it sounds familiar.
yeah, if you Google it, you'll see the
Yeah.
lyrics, and it was, it was I think it was, like, written during, like, probably the height of the Cold War or something like that when, nuclear holocaust was, on everybody's minds, and so it has some, um, I guess, probably vestiges of that, those kind of sentiments in there. But when I, was writing this originally, like when I was a teenager, that song was on my mind, and so that's where that whole living forever
Okay.
thing came from. So
That makes sense. So they're not out hunting dragons or, you know, but that's fine.
not really.
'Cause
Though
maybe the
there are,
dragons don't need hunting.
right, there are some creatures in the world that are not necessarily always friendly. Uh, it's kind of funny when I was writing this, I didn't, I guess there's some like fantasy tropes that often,
Yeah.
like dragons and elves, and there are some of those things in there, but I didn't really know a lot of those when I was writing this, to be honest with you, and so not a lot of those things made their way into the story, and if they are there, they don't form a huge part. They're mentioned as maybe like a snippet here and there. So I think when sometimes people are looking for a very sort of specific brand of fantasy or
Right.
science fiction or whatever that's their particular flavor, and if they don't quite find it, they get kind of like out of sorts. Um, so I would say this is probably a light version of that, because most of it's focused on the characters as opposed to this particular goblin or whatever, those kind of things like that.
And there's a place in fantasy for that, like, not every book needs to be about dragon slayers. I don't
Sure.
have any dragon slayers. Well, they're trying to make friends with the dragon. We'll find out in a later book if they actually succeed. That's the intention. Who knows what the dragons want?
Yeah.
So I'm very much in that same camp where we're not I mean, I know what the tropes were, but, like, I liked these dragons. I didn't wanna hunt them down.
There you go, there you go,
What
yeah.
other paths can we explore with this?
Right. So that little story that,
Yeah.
Logan and his friend Aurora are reading in the library orphanage as children was actually a reference to that. And it was a little, I guess, it was a poem, but then it became a song that I
Mm,
included in the 13th hour, about how people try to basically hunt the dragons down and kill them off in hopes of essentially being able to accumulate the wealth that they are associated with. So it's a very, like, it's kind of like dark and maybe, I
mm.
don't know, postmodern or something like that. But it's so those some of those tropes are there, I guess, but they're sort of there as like in little pieces.
No, and that's I mean, they don't have to be there. No one there's no, like, trope checklist when you're writing, you're like, "Oh,
Right.
do I have Dragon
Right.
Slayer? Check this off.
Yeah.
Is the main
Yeah.
character an orphan? Check this off.
Yeah.
Are they
Yeah.
the chosen one?" Yeah, I mean, there isn't a checklist like that,
Right.
and
Right.
I
Right.
don't
Yeah.
there shouldn't be because there's all different types of readers out there who are looking for all different types of stories, and I think, it's good that there are those stories that check all the trope boxes because there's a lot of people who want that. But if somebody is not looking for something that checks all the trope boxes, it's great that there is fantasy books out there that's like
Right.
exploring
Sure.
other things that you can do besides the trope checklist.
Right. Yeah. So one thing that this book doesn't do, the 13th Hour does, is it's written from a couple different points of view. I don't think I would do this again if I had to do it, but at the time I wanted to do it. Um, wh- and it's one of the reasons why I eventually, when I was going to publish it, decided that I would do it independently, because what I originally had wanted to do was I wanted to have each perspective written in a different colored ink, and that was,
Oh,
at the time, was enormously expensive and was not going to be like, when I told that, I remember looking for agents and sort of traditional, they were like, no, there's no way anybody's going to do anything like that. uh
and it might be
so
hard to read too, like different colors. That might be hard on like the eyes for
it's
someone
it's a
trying to
little
read that.
it's a
Yeah.
little hard on the eyes. I don't know if you've ever read the Neverending Story in a hardcover form,
No, I've
but
only seen
it
the
is,
movie a
yeah,
million times.
yeah,
I feel
yeah.
like it was
So
on all the time when I was a kid.
right, right. So same here. But if you ever read the book, the original one, in like hardcover form, it is written in blue or green and red text for the different characters. So Bastion, the
Really?
is written in red, I believe, which is a little hard on the eyes. I would say red on a white background is a little bit hard. And then Atreyu, I believe, is green, because I think in the book his skin is supposed to be green, if I remember right. And I think they weren't able to do that for the movie. But um,
Really?
yeah, and when the book is printed in black and white, like soft cover,
Yeah.
I don't actually know what they do there. I think they just ignore that part and it's just all black. But I wanted to do that, but obviously that, it's very, um, it's hard to do that, obviously, with for just an expense perspective. But that's a long way of saying, like, there's a portion of the 13th Hour that's told from Aurora's perspective as well. So Aurora's his Logan's best friend. They grew up together in the orphanage, and so she, serendipity happens, and they encounter each other later in that, and later in the 13th Hour, and she joins him on his quest when he doesn't have anybody else, but he's alone essentially at that point. They kind of meet up and reconnect sort of as adults. Um, but there's a section that's told from her perspective, as well as a few other instances where there's some perspective changes. But this particular story is all from Logan's perspective, because I think, it's for the size of it, it's very kind of small and focused, and it made more sense to keep it just with one perspective.
No, and it's nice sometimes to have like a book that is smaller in scope and just one point of view rather than trying to keep track of like, I don't know if you've ever read the Malazan Book of the Fallen, but like in like the first one, like
Hmm.
you've like multiple points of view. They're in multiple places doing multiple things.
Yeah.
Each one of them has a bunch, their group of side characters, and you have to keep track of all that, and you start to be like,
Right.
I need a
Yeah.
I need a spreadsheet.
Right.
So sometimes you want a book that is just one person and they're one circle of friends, and you don't have to get out your scorecard and be like, okay, Galen is here, Logan is here. This one's doing this one's doing that. They're on this continent, this on
Right.
this one. You don't have to worry about that. They're
Yeah.
in one place doing one thing, and that can be like they can be very engaging because you can get very deep into their point of view and you can get their perspective on the world. You can I think and I feel like you can go deeper with the world building because it's not just what they're doing, but like because you spend all your time in their head, or most of it, if they're living their life. If they walk by some cool thing or someone says something that triggers them to remember some neat
Hmm.
thing, or someone says something about some cool facet of their world that maybe they weren't as interested in, you know you can get all these extra fun layers that maybe don't We were talking about this in a podcast earlier because I was a guest on somebody's podcast,
Yeah,
and I think that like you're doing this disservice when you're saying, oh well, it's one perspective and one you can get sometimes a wider view of things and a deeper view of things when you are so enmeshed in a certain character. And I
sure.
like that. I like being enmeshed in the character, whether it's one character or five. I don't think that matters so much.
Yeah.
You can
Yeah,
get
I
like
agree with
this
you.
great view.
Yeah, I tend to agree.
Yeah. So is there any, since we've opened that can of worms. Is there any cool features of Logan's world or the magic or anything that you want to gush about while we're here?
I would say there are some magical elements and aspects of things like that, but I think when I was writing these books, I guess I my focus was less on creating a a depiction of another country or world. I didn't necessarily. There's nothing wrong with
Mhm.
travelogue style writing, but I didn't feel that that was going to be my strength. I
Right.
felt like I was probably better suited to be able to talk about the individual characters, and so when I explain what it is to people, I often say, 'cause, people ask, "Oh, what's your book about?" "Tell me what's your book,"
Yeah.
"Yeah, give your summary," and I'm like, "Oh god, I don't know." I don't know if you encounter that and you struggle to encapsulate that, but I often will say
The
like,
longer the
"Well."
series gets, the, like, harder it becomes to,
Yeah,
like, "Wait, what
totally,
did we
right?
do in book 1?
Yeah,
We did stuff, okay? Ask me
yeah,
about book 10 because I just finished that. We did stuff in
yeah,
book 1. It was good.
right,
You'll enjoy
yeah.
it."
Yeah,
I'm
just like
like, I
read the
don't
back,
remember.
if you like it,
That
but,
was 7
um
years ago. I don't remember
yeah,
what we did in book 1.
yeah,
It has a
yeah.
blurb. You should read it.
Right, exactly, that's what it's for, right?
Right?
Yeah, but, I often say, like, well, it's kinda like if you took, like, '80s movies like Labyrinth and The Last Starfighter and, like, those John Hughes, like, teen movies like The Breakfast Club
Mhm.
and Some Kind of Wonderful, and you put them in a book form. It's essentially that's kinda what it is, uh, and because a lot of those stories essentially are like miniature fairy tales. If
I
you look at a
see.
lot of those because it was like one movie that was kind of like, and there wasn't one that came before, there wasn't one that came after the whole series thing. A lot of those films that were fantasy or sci-fi or whatever, they just got one movie. That's it, you know,
Yeah,
and they were kind of like they had to introduce the characters, create the conflict, and wrap it all up in under 2 hours, and you probably wouldn't get it. You may not get anything else. So I guess I
but
liked
we
that
could.
idea.
We
We
could.
could, we could, right?
Because Willow was one movie, one
That's true,
thing
that's
wrapped
true.
up, and then Disney decided to do a show on it. So,
Right,
as Hollywood becomes more desperate for stories, like, we could
right,
get Neverending 2. I don't know if
right.
there was a sequel or The Last Starfighter,
There was a sequel to the Neverending
Generation
Story.
X.
Is rather ass, but, yeah. No, yeah, but, at the time, there wasn't anything, right? I mean,
Right.
at the then there wasn't, and so I have thought of a lot of those films as kinda like miniature fairy tales, and even a lot of those teen movies that existed at the time, they often had a little bit of a lesson to teach people, about, being a good friend or, not being too full of yourself or,
Right,
those
right.
kind of things like that, right? And so I wanted the dialogue to be very kind of casual, and so one of the things that, and this is a very personal thing, I know this throws other people off. When I was writing the dialogue for the characters, I wanted it to be just like people are talking in today's
Mm,
world, as opposed to
yeah.
"Thou shalt do this" or whatever, because, I mean, that's just, medieval Europe, I mean, the rest of the world didn't necessarily talk like that. And did they really talk like that at the time? I don't know. Who knows? I mean, none of us were there. So, and it's very difficult to read now. So,
But in their minds, it would have sounded to them like our vernacular does today, because
right,
if that's how everybody talks, that sounds normal to you.
right,
You
right.
know what I mean? So
Yeah,
I agree with you. I write my books also in the same English that you find today. There's
right,
no weirdness. I mean, if they're talking to like a 2,000-year-old entity who's been asleep all that time and not interacting with things, then I would bring it out, only because if they've had no contact with anyone, you would not expect them to speak
right. It makes sense.
like,
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Because like
yeah,
language shifts,
right,
because people are using it and it's living. But if you've been frozen in a tomb for 2,000 years, you better come out using your these and thous, and or whatever was the equivalent to you better come out of it, to with some kind of speech thing that sounds archaic, because you haven't had anybody to talk to, and
right.
you
Totally.
know
Yeah,
to
totally.
get the way that we talk now. So yeah,
Yeah,
and I think a lot. I don't everyone's there's only like I'd say I have read a few books that did use the these and the thous, but they were set in a it was more historical fantasy set
right.
in a
Sure.
particular time, and that was normal to those people. And
Hmm.
the way they did it was like they constructed the way, and it was the way they did it was to they tried to not use it like, hit you over the head with it, but like because in dialogue and stuff, the people to them, like when you're in somebody's head, you didn't hear it so much. You more heard it when like they were talking to somebody from some other part of the area or whatever. Like it was very interesting how they used it. So it
Sure.
wasn't
Yeah.
like super annoying or anything, because that could get really annoying. I
Right. 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 Sure.
can't remember what book
Yeah.
that was.
Yeah, I think I get what you're saying because I mean it's it you want to strike a line between
Yeah.
creating an atmosphere, but also not like making it hard to read. You know,
Yes.
so I think I was essentially writing something that I wanted to read when I was a kid, and still would run a read now, and so for the longest time, I really had a struggle in determining who the audience of a lot of these books would be because my primary audience
Mm.
was always me first. It's like, well, I'm just writing it because I wanted to read something like that. The ironic thing, of course, is like once you've done the zillion edits or whatever you have to do to get the thing published, you don't want to read it. But I mean,
No. Yeah, that's when you
um,
start thinking, well, maybe I should do a second edition and make it for other people, since I don't want to read it
yeah, exactly,
anymore.
yeah, yeah. But at some point you gotta, like, let it go and
Mhm.
just kinda move on, but that was the premise, and so, it took quite a while to kind of figure out who, like, the demographic, I guess, would be, and so I would say, like, the all these stories are really about characters, and even though it's a fantasy world, where there's things that probably can't happen in our world, it's still about some of the same conflicts and issues that people, uh, you, me, friends, family, all have, dealing with things like self confidence and loneliness and fear and all these other kinds of things that are very human kinds of things like that, and how you don't necessarily have to let those limit you in various ways.
No, it's true. It's true. And too often we do let those things limit us. And sometimes we don't even realize it. Like we need somebody outside of us to like point it out. And sometimes there isn't someone there in that moment to be like, "Hey, you're limiting yourself," you
Right.
know. And we just internalize, well, that is my limit, and I think it becomes harder than to push past it. But hopefully,
Sure.
as one matures, one realizes, okay, that is a self-imposed thing. This is not, I mean, unless it's something like a physical thing, like if you broke your leg, well, yeah, don't run a marathon,
Right.
you
Right.
know?
Right.
Like there's some limits that are, that you have to accept, so you don't like do more harm to yourself.
Right, right, right.
But yeah.
And I guess to bring it full circle, I had mentioned starting off talking about the martial arts
Mm,
angle. In that, I mean, it could be really anything, but in that particular thing as it was in this story, you're doing essentially a physical discipline, and it's also, in the fighting with another person, it's unpredictable, and so
Mm.
you learn things about yourself and your own limits, and especially as you encounter discomfort and pain and all those other things like that. Uh, in doing that, you learn that, okay, yes, I have some limits and those kind of things, but I don't necessarily have to be. Those aren't necessarily a bad thing, and they're also necessarily permanent. I may be able to push beyond them and do things I haven't, thought that were possible.
And that's the cool thing, because you're testing your limits in every fight, essentially.
Right. Yeah.
And how many of us do that, you know?
Yeah, and I think even on a day-to-day basis, right? Because I think like, many people will pick up martial arts, I think like that to learn how to defend themselves or whatever. But I would probably say, like, if you're getting in fights, like, all the time, like, 1, you're probably doing it wrong, and, like, 2, like, what the hell is wrong with you? Maybe a better thing would be, like, instead of learning how to fight people, devote, like, you know, how to be less of a jerk so you're not getting in so many fights, or maybe moving to an area where you're at less risk of being attacked. And so I think, like, for your average person who's not necessarily getting into physical confrontations all that much, especially as, like, you get older, like, hopefully
Right.
stuff breaks, it's like, you enter your 40s and you're like, everything hurts, and hopefully you don't want to get in fights all that much.
True.
So, I think it ends up being, okay, I'm doing this physical discipline that's pushing my limits. Is there a parallel to how I approach other scenarios? Maybe are not necessarily physically as taxing or dangerous or whatever, but are also things I might otherwise avoid or whatever, you know. And I think that ends up being a something that ends up helping your day to day life.
Right, right. I could see how that would be helpful. Yeah, not getting into fights all the time could be very beneficial for your well-being.
Right. Right. Yeah.
I hope nobody out there is getting into fights all the time. If you are, maybe calm down, maybe get some anger management,
Yeah,
maybe get
yeah,
new
do some
friends.
therapy, yeah, just maybe spend some time, move to another area where it's less dangerous
Yeah, yeah.
if you have that option.
Maybe just choose different people to be around, because sometimes we are the people that we are around. Like you take on, if people around you are, very argumentative, and you become that way too, because that's who you're hanging out with.
Sure,
That
yeah,
starts to seem like, well, that's what I should be doing. I should be arguing with everybody. So
sure,
maybe check the people around you and see if maybe it might be them and their influence.
yes, yeah.
But, yeah. Is there anything else you wanna say about the book? Because I do want us to also talk about some of the other things that you do.
Yeah, I would say I would say the last thing is it's part of a bigger whole and a bunch of other stories. But it's, sometimes people wonder like, "Oh, where do I start?" Like, they get overwhelmed because they don't
Yeah.
necessarily know, like, especially if it's multiple different parts, like, you can start at any one of those pieces. So this is a perfectly good place to start, and then you can always fill in details later. It was designed that way, because I remember when I was a kid looking at book 2 of 4, and it's like, "Well, maybe I could start here because the cover is cool," and discovering that I couldn't, and that being very disappointing, so
Yeah,
I didn't want
and
that to happen with my books.
yeah, but, like, traditionally published books, like, I think they on purpose didn't put, like, any sort of numbering or anything, so you didn't know what book in the series. I remember
Yeah, I
being
think
very
you're right.
frustrated about
I think
that,
you're
that
right. I didn't
I
never thought of
found
that
all,
before.
like, the 3 books in a trilogy, and I'm looking at them like, "Well, which one is book 1?" And having to, like, go, open each of them up and look for a list of books to see, do they list the trilogy? Do they list the books in it? What order
Yeah,
do we read this in?
right.
Because and, like, because I was a teenager, like, the internet existed, but, like, it was not at all like it is now. Like,
No, yeah,
even if you, like, Googled something, like, Google was a popularity contest then, so the top thing that came up might not actually be useful.
yeah,
It might not even have your answer, and you
right,
could ask
right.
Jeeves, and Jeeves might not
Ask
give you the
Jeeves. Oh,
correct
yeah,
answer.
totally.
Like, there
Ask Jeeves.
wasn't Yeah, we didn't have like Goodreads and like all that stuff was like came a
Yeah.
little bit
I
later.
don't think there was even
So
Google for quite a while. I mean, what was the
there was
beginning? It was
like
like Netscape
search engine.
Navigator, or
Yeah.
what was it? I don't remember, the Alta Vista, or that, a few of
Yeah.
those. But yeah.
It was just I remember that like you had to hope that in the front of the book they listed all the books in the series,
Yeah.
and because that was the only way you could find out like, well, which book am I holding?
Right, totally. Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
and
I
sometimes it's at
think,
the front
yeah.
of the book, sometimes it was hidden, it was at the back of the book, sometimes they had excerpts, so you're flipping through the goddamn book in the
Yeah.
store like, "What book are you?"
Well, and
You
God
know?
forbid you actually got like a, like, it was book 5 or of 7, but the 5 is actually a prequel. And you're like, "Well, where does this one fit in?"
Right?
Yeah,
And it's not on the list and you're like, "But," or because like, in a lot of, traditionally published books, which is all we had access to
yeah,
then, was they did them in trilogies. And then when they started a new trilogy, there'd be a new book by the author, and you'd be like, "Well," sometimes they'd have other books by that author, but they wouldn't list the book you had in your
and
hand, so you're like, "I have no idea where this fits. Where does
right,
this fit in all of this?" And it
yeah,
could be I remember it just being very confusing, as at the time I was trying to read I was reading the Mercedes Lackey's Valdemar
uh-huh,
books and trying to figure out where to start, which books were in Rich trilogies, what book am I holding in my hand, where does it fit in this thing?
yeah,
Because she has, like there was, like, 20 or like, I think about 20 books out in various trilogies when I found the series, I was like 15, and I was like, "I don't know where to start or what I'm even holding in my hands."
yeah, I know,
You
right?
know?
Yeah,
Is this a
yeah,
book
yeah.
1 of something?
Well, I'm ashamed to say this, but it took me really long time to finally get that out of my head, that I probably should start at the first one, because I would just start somewhere, and I was like, "Ah, I'll just figure it out," but I never
Mm,
did. I never figured out, like, really the other stuff, and I would ultimately get frustrated, and I probably would have had a better experience. One, maybe if I just, like, you know, asked the librarian and said, like, "Okay, can you help me with this?" For whatever reason, that didn't occur to me. And then 2, if I just, like, started with the beginning. And just as you pointed out, like, I'm realizing that it wasn't always so easy to actually figure out where the
no.
beginning was.
Sometimes,
So,
especially if you were
yeah.
not in, like, a big city, like, I grew up in a suburb at the edge of the metro area for New York City, and, like, our bookstores were small there, and, like, they'd only get so many books, and they usually only had, like, the latest releases, and the latest release might be book 4 in a series, or something else if it's a longer series, and they may have 1 or 2 of the books that preceded it, but it may not be book 1,
Right,
and you were
right,
sort of
sure.
limited by what was there. But at least the good thing about traditionally published books was a lot of them were written so that n- so that they're standalone or that you could pick it up anywhere. Like
Yeah,
it might refer to events in another book, but the whole story in that other book was wrapped up. So there were some loose ends, but the loose ends weren't like crucial to that plot.
yeah,
Um, and that book that you picked up, whether it was book 2 or book 5, was its own full and complete story. So you might be a little confused when they refer back to stuff in a previous book, but it wasn't important to the plot. It was more background information about the
right.
character that you
Yeah.
could get later. Because I did
Mhm.
start a few series in the middle because I didn't have a choice and they sounded really cool. And I couldn't find the
Sure.
earlier books. And I was like, you know what? Forget it. I'm just going to buy this and read this. And I know it's not the first book. I will just try to, I'll just, try not to be annoyed when there's stuff that like I don't get because I there are books before it and I don't have them. And if I ever do get them, I will read all of it.
Oh, there you go. There you go. You were
Yeah.
you were probably smarter than I am, and also more patient in that regard.
I
So,
was also 15 at the time that I found the fantasy book section. And so like I think I was older than you.
yeah.
So and I was determined to figure this out. I was so
Well, there you
excited
go.
to
That
finally
counts for a
find
lot.
books, that were telling the stories that I was telling people. I didn't
Yeah,
know there were fantasy books until I found that section. And 'cause it was like hidden all the way in the back in this and they had it was L. Ron Hubbard, Mercedes Lackey, the Anne McCaffrey books, and there was one other and that was it. Those were your
Yeah.
only options for fantasy books.
Gotcha. Yeah, yeah.
They didn't even
Yeah.
have the Lord of the Rings or the Hobbit.
Okay, interesting. Yeah.
So, that was my introduction to fantasy. I was like 14 or 15 years old. Um, and I was like, wow, okay. They have dragons and they're doing cool stuff and magic, and there's books about the stories in my head. I need to figure this out. I want to know more. So
Yeah.
I was motivated,
Yeah,
you
there you
know.
go. Yeah. Yeah.
Do
I just like the covers, so that was the
Yeah.
thing that kind of always drew me in, and that's why, as much as possible, I've tried to include illustrations in, because I think, at least for me, I probably think probably more visually, or, what's sound, as
Yeah.
opposed to sort of the written word. And so how I ended up becoming, a writer is weird. I mean, but you do what you can. But I think, like, that's why I've often included other things, because I think, when I envision the story, it's often not necessarily in a narrative form. It's often like an image or a piece of music or something like that first, and then I have to, like, backtrack and then sort of recreate the actual story that goes with that. If that I don't know if that makes any sense, but
Yeah, no, that's a cool way of doing it. I'm the opposite. The story is there first,
Mhm.
and trying to like get covers and images. Like I am not visual, and so I have a hard time with that aspect. I mean, I see the story when I'm writing it and stuff. Like
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
very
yeah,
visual
yeah.
that way, but like trying to come up with like one single image that like represents it and is marketable is like
Oh, that's
it's
so
just
hard.
like
That's so hard.
so hard. It's
So
like
hard.
climbing a mountain would be easier
Yeah.
for
Yeah,
me.
totally, yeah.
You just keep putting one foot in front of the other and you eventually get there. You
Yeah,
could work on images all day long and not end up with anything that looks like a
right.
good cover.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely.
That's the so for me that visual part is hard. But seeing the story in my head as I'm writing it, that's super easy.
Sure.
Getting that out where somebody else could see it in an art form, that for me is difficult.
I
But
I
you
very I relate. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, very much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you all the links will be, and there's a lot of them, will be in the description to get empty hands and to get your hands on the empty hands.
Oh,
I had to do it. I'm sorry.
okay.
I've been waiting all this time to say that. And I messed it up on the first try. um
I never thought
and
about that, so
you can
that's a
use
good one.
that now.
I may have to steal with that. Yeah,
I'm giving you
yeah.
that one for free.
Okay, thank you.
You may have that.
Yeah,
And don't forget to like follow, share this podcast. There's going to be a part 2 to this podcast because Joshua Blum does other things that are fantasy related that are really cool. So I hope you'll stick around for that episode. So we're gonna cut this one here. And we are recording this on January 27th. Oh, one thing we didn't go into, which we're going to do before we cut the book section and move to the next section of the
mm,
show,
sure.
is you said that it's the 13th hour is a series. How many books are published in it? Is it a completed series? Are you still working on it? What are you writing now?
Yeah, so still working on it. It is one main book, The 13th Hour, and then there's this one, and then, oh, let's see,
This one
there's
is
a
the Empty Hands novella. Go
yeah,
on.
there's a novella, which is kind of fits inside of it.
Mhm.
There's a prequel, a little prequel, called Shadow in the Moonlight, and then there's an epilogue, which is more of like a short story, and then, there's a children's book. So, what's that? I don't know. There's a couple things, and then I'm working on 2 other books
For the
at
same
that.
series or
Same series, same series,
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
that's
I
cool.
write some other stuff, kinda just for fun. It's not like formally it's I publish. I don't know, you even use the word publish, but, I put it out on a platform called Wattpad, and, it's about the character, The Rocketeer, if you ever watched that movie from the early
Yes. Oh my
'90s.
god, I loved that.
Yeah, and so
There
I
was
write
something
some.
about it that I just really loved.
Yeah, it's my favorite movie. So, the, the character of Logan is a little part of a couple of the protagonists from some of my favorite movies, and one of which is Cliff Secord from The Rocketeer. He's partly that. But I write that. That's just for fun, and I put
So
that
wait,
out on
is that
Wattpad.
Rocketeer fan fiction?
Yes, it is Rocketeer fan fiction. Yes, yeah,
That's exciting.
yeah.
Did you give me a link for that in
Probably
all the
not, but
things?
I certainly can if you so desire.
I think we
Yeah.
should put a link to that because
Okay, all right.
that's sort of fun. And like
I'll
the
send that to
Rocketeer
you.
was such a fun movie, and if folks
Yeah,
haven't seen it, they definitely should.
yeah, I
It's a
agree.
feel good, fun action adventure.
Exactly, that's how I would describe it in a nutshell. And so I write some stories and do other things that are kind of all related to that. So I just made a card game that is a little Rocketeer card game that you can that's in the appendix of one of the stories. So
Oh, okay.
yeah.
Wow. You just all over in a good way.
Yeah, I mean, all that's more or less for fun. It's stuff that I'll do with like my kids or whatever. It's not like to it I have a day job. I most of this stuff doesn't earn, any money,
It
but
earns
but
love.
it's fun,
It it
and that's
lights
why
you
I
up
do it.
inside.
It does, and it keeps me going, so that's why I do it.
That's awesome. So, all right. So when will those next two books be in the 13th
Oh
hour
my.
series?
Oh my
Do you
god.
like so for the listener in the future, because we're recording this in
Yes.
January 27, 2024. So like should if they're listening 6 months from now, like we're 3 months from now, is there
Yes.
like a date that you hope to have the next 13th hour installment out?
There will be a 13th, there's one, I wouldn't not the books in the next 6 months, but there's one, so there's a little, like, I guess you could call it like an EP, like a collection of songs that go with this book
Okay.
we just talked about, Empty Hands. It is embedded in the text, but you can listen to it separately. And there's a one LP, like an album for the 13th hour, and there's another one that, for music that didn't make it into the first, the first CD, that'll probably be out in the next 6 months.
Okay.
So,
So
eh
maybe a year from now, the next book, because you got to do the music and then figure out, okay, what story is the music telling?
right, right, yeah. Yeah. So something along those lines. In the next 6 months, definitely there'll be an album, that'll come out that says more music from the 13th hour, essentially, and then, and then after that, then I would say probably more books. The outlines are basically written. Some of the songs are actually written, but, uh, being able to and then, kind of sit down and put it all together and that kind of stuff like that,
Mm.
that's a much longer thing, as I'm sure you well know.
Does the outline have its own soundtrack?
There are some songs that are the outline itself is not doesn't necessarily have songs, built into it, but there are songs that, are written that can fit into it, if that makes any sense. So, yeah, so
Yeah, that's
partly,
cool. That's
yeah.
cool. That's really neat that there's how do you play any instruments? How do you make the music?
Yeah, so some of it is just traditionally, like, done on, like, the guitar or, the piano, but, some of it is just, electronic. It's, a synthesizer, and it's done that way. Most of them are a combination of all 3. So some of the I don't know how well you could hear some of the ones that we're playing, um, but, most of those were, there was that was synthesizer stuff, and
Okay, that's what it sounded like to me,
there's no
but
vocals or
yeah,
anything like that. Some of them have vocals or, like, parts that I've recorded on, like, more traditional instruments.
that's very cool. That's really neat that the books have a soundtrack. Like, I always wanted, like, a soundtrack, but, like, the sweeping epic music like Lord of the Rings for my
Yeah,
books, but,
yeah.
there currently is none, it's only I it's there is none, I would someday I'd like that, but someone would have to compose that who isn't me
Someday.
because I don't I just have the Lord of the Rings soundtrack in my head when I write my books.
Sure, sure.
It's
Yeah,
kind
yeah.
of already been used.
Yeah.
We can't use that. It would need something new and different, so I would need Bear McCreary or what's his name, who did the his name, James Horner. Uh,
Yeah, James Horner did the
yeah,
Rocketeer soundtrack, yeah. Yeah, sure.
yeah. I need one of them to make me a soundtrack
Yeah, yeah.
because that's beyond my skill.
Well, maybe, like, I've thought about this, and maybe if, in doing, like, a if you've ever done, uh, or created your own audiobook, I mean, I've thought about this. I haven't exactly done that, but, I
Oh,
mean,
like
it'd
the
be nice
soundscapes.
to have,
The
like, the music in the background when you're, like,
Yeah,
yeah, you know?
what's his name does the sound. He does it for the Tolkien books.
Mm,
Uh,
yeah.
he just did a Kickstarter that I backed a few months back, and he's doing a soundtrack for the Silmarillion.
Oh, wow, okay.
He's done ones that you can play while listening to The Hobbit and all of the Lord of the Rings books.
Yeah.
And it syncs with the Andy Serkis version. That's the Andy Serkis narrated
Wow.
version that you played
Yeah,
Gollum.
very nice.
Yeah, he
Yeah.
does these soundscapes. It's not just music, it's also like I bought the ones for all the Lord of the Rings books because I'm a huge nerd.
Mhm.
I have my nerd card in my wallet.
There you go, there you go. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
um
yeah.
yeah, and it's a whole soundscape, and it's meant to sync up. I haven't figured out how to sync it. It's a podcast, and it
Oh,
syncs
interesting.
directly with the music, and I haven't quite figured out how to get both to play while listening to the audiobook on Audible,
Oh,
but
that's
apparently it's
fascinating.
possible. So
Huh.
it's just nice listening to the soundscape. Sometimes
Yeah, that's fascinating.
it's music, but it's also ambiance. Like,
Right,
what would Khazad-dûm sound like if you were just, there in that
right.
scene?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Maybe there's music, maybe it's just like the sounds you would hear if you were it's like it sets your imagination on fire. Like, so that might be
Yeah,
something that you might want to do, since since the music comes first, is like the soundscape, not just music, but like what other sounds, like, as they're
soundscape,
like walking
interesting,
around,
yeah.
is there birds chirping, is there leaves
Oh, yeah,
rustling,
that's
is the
true.
wind lightly blowing. Like, it's really neat.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I never thought
I
about
need
that
to get
before.
I
Yeah,
have his name. I'm on his
yeah,
Discord. Let me get his
yeah.
name for you so you can check him out, because he does the soundscapes. The one he's working on now is Aya, which is the world. All right, I'm a huge nerd. We've admitted this. That's the world that the Lord of the Rings books take place in. It's called
Yeah.
Aya. That's where Middle Earth is. It's in Aya. And
Oh, okay.
yeah, let me just find, because I'm on his Discord, but Discord is hiding from me. It's always when you need something that your computer is like, no, we're just not going to show you. Let me see. It's
I struggle with Discord. Every time
not
I use
like
that thing, I struggle.
his Discord is called a long expected Discord.
There you
His
go.
name it's Jordan Rannells. And he has, like, he's on, you know, YouTube, and he has his own website. He's doing like soundscapes right now for Harry Potter,
Mm,
and he did Winnie the Pooh. Um, it's very cool and immersive, and
mm,
it's Jordan Reynolds. It's his last name has two N's and two L's.
gotcha.
Um, yeah, and if you just like look up, if you just Google him, like, um, it's very cool. He does Kickstarters, and they get like hundreds of thousands of uh you know he gets lots. It's such a cool thing, and there's so many people who are interested in that, and having soundscapes and to go along with their books. So, like, that might be something for you to look into,
It's a
especially
great
since you
idea.
think first about the music. Because that's what started him. I think was that he was like, I wonder what does, he started with, like, I don't remember if it's The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings. Like, well, what does this sound like? Like you're in
Mhm. Yeah,
Rivendell. What does that sound like?
yeah.
And
It's interesting, yeah.
yeah, so it's like ambiance,
Yeah,
but also music, because he also brings in like notes, like things from the movie, but like the movie soundtrack is not nearly long enough to be listened
yeah.
to
Right,
along
right,
with the
right. Along
books.
with the
They're
book,
a lot
right. Yeah,
longer.
yeah.
it's a cool thing. And I know that there's other authors out there who do playlists for their books. So that, and there's definitely a lot of people like you who want to experience the music or the soundscape with the book.
Yeah.
So that might be that might be an audience for you to tap into.
Oh, look
So
at
so
that.
check that
That's
out
interesting. I never
and
even
see what
thought of
he
that. Yeah.
does. Yeah, check him out
Mhm.
on YouTube so you can hear some of that for, and see and hear what he's doing and see if that might be something you want to get into for your own books to create like a richer experience.
It's interesting, like, there's those, like, whatever, 4-hour, videos or more on YouTube, which is just like, I don't know, they sometimes bill it like as like sleep music or study music or
Yes,
these
I
other kind
love
of things.
them.
It's like
I
a
listen to
hobbit
them while I
hole
write.
and
Yes.
and there's like, wind blowing and like, rustling leaves and stuff
My
like
favorite
that.
My favorite is like they'll loop like
Yeah.
certain songs, or they'll make them into loops even though they
Right, right,
weren't,
right.
like
Yeah,
Lord of the
yeah. Right,
Rings,
right.
like various
Yeah,
soundtrack
that's yeah,
music
yeah.
from the Lord of the Rings
Totally,
or from
totally.
other things, and sometimes they'll add like rain or like other like soothing like sound effects with it. Like there's a Hobbit one where it's just raining in Hobbiton, and you have the music, some of the quieter music or the calmer music from the Hobbit scenes with like rain
Yeah.
sounds, and the thunder will grumble every like few minutes, but like the kind of grumble where it's like miles away, like it's not like right over you, kind of,
Right.
you
No,
know.
that's a great idea. Yeah.
Yeah, and,
Yeah, that's a good
I
idea.
write I when I'm writing, like, I need, like, music that loops, that
Yeah.
because I can
Yeah.
just focus and, like, it be like, as the music is going and I'm there, and it just something about, like, it, like, being 4 or 8 or, like, hours of the same thing over and over again, like, it just gives you that, like, time to really focus. I don't know why, it, like, flips some switch in my brain, and I can
Huh.
write for hours to it.
Huh.
Um I know a lot of
Interesting.
there's a devoted fan base for that on YouTube.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not just on YouTube because there's a whole playlist of it on Spotify.
Right.
Um, and they also take the music that's composed for movie trailers
Right.
and they put those together into like 4 or 5 hour or 2 hour mixes, and they try to match it up so that it seems to flow from song to song and like one never ending like epic like sequence. Um
Right. Yeah.
I love those. I'm such a nerd. This is what my YouTube playlists look like.
Oh, that's great. That's great. I think that's a great idea, actually. I
Yeah,
I
and
have to
like
look into that.
and
I
there's people like me who focus better with that, you
with me
know?
yeah, with something like that in the background.
Yes.
I did one, for one of the 13th hour tracks. It's like a more of a slower kind of meditative thing, and the original track itself, I think, was like, I don't know, 2 minutes or something like that, but then
Right.
I was like, "Well, can I make it like 10 minutes?" And I think so I feel like there is a 10-minute version, that it may even be on YouTube. I know I did it at some point, um, but I that's an interesting thing about making it with
Yeah.
all the sounds and of nature or whatever that sort of, give you an idea about the environment that you might be in.
You'll also get, like, the kindest comments on those videos because the people who tend to listen to that are using it for meditation, to study, so the comments
Yeah.
will be like, "Anybody reading this comment, I wish you the best day you've ever had and
Oh, that's
internal
so
peace,"
nice.
and it'll just be a whole wall of comments like that of people leaving, like, well wishes, so, like,
Wow.
I find so it's so sometimes, like, if you can't focus, you're having a bad day, you just read through all the comments underneath them, or if it's a live, some of them they stream them live, and the chat is just all of that, like, "I've got a test tomorrow, I'm studying, and, oh, good luck, we hope," sending you positive vibes and
Oh,
wishes for A's
that's so
and
nice.
top
It's,
marks. Yeah, it's
as
like the
opposed to
chiller,
the usual.
nicer, yeah,
Yeah,
corners. It
right.
brings out the best in people, and some people
Huh.
use it to meditate, some people use it to study, I use it to write
Yeah,
too.
right, yeah.
Um,
That's true. I'm gonna have to go check that out, as
yeah,
opposed to yeah,
there's also, like, cozy cottage hobbit type core music.
right, yeah,
There's tavern style cozy music. There's a whole bunch of different ones, and then there's, like, adventure, but a little calmer, on a loop. There's all different types, and it's I love it. I think it's
Yeah,
fantastic because it's I need music to write to, but like this, if
I
the
agree.
songs keep changing, then I get distracted, and I'm like,
Yeah.
you know. But
Right.
if it's the same, or it's like slowly easing from one thing into another, I can just keep. Ooh, as I knock over something, you just keep going. I can't type. If you're listening to this, you can't see that I'm talking with my hands. They're just all over the place. I'm sorry for the bang. It was me knocking stuff over. Um, yeah, I'll stop because I'm getting too animated.
No,
there's,
that's all
there's too many
right.
things here, and I don't want to send the keyboard flying and the microphone flying next. And we okay, so we're gonna end this episode here, and then we're gonna come back and talk about some of the other things that Joshua Blum does.
Okay,
So
totally.
we're officially cutting this one here. Joshua will be coming back on a future episode, and we'll talk about his podcast and the other things that he does that are related to the 13th hour. And so I hope you'll come back for that, and I hope you'll be back next week for another episode of Fantasy Lore and More. So we'll have another fantasy author and another fantasy book. Don't forget to like, subscribe, follow all the things so you get notified when that comes out. Have a great day or great night wherever you are.